the question that people should be asking is, why not including pregnant women? And it needs to be justified now why we are excluding pregnant women from a potentially very beneficial vaccine or medication for that matter, or an intervention.
Welcome to When Science Finds a Way, a podcast about the science changing the world. I'm Alisha Wainwright, and this is where you'll find stories of hope from people on the front line of our biggest health challenges. And hope is the key word today because we'll be hearing about how we're starting to see a shift in how we run medical research, specifically vaccine trials, to make them more inclusive for pregnant women and people. You'll have seen the labels. If you're pregnant or breastfeeding, consult your doctor before using this product. Well, that's almost always because it simply wouldn't have been tested on them. And this applies to many vaccines too. Despite changes to guidelines about how and when to include pregnant women and people in drug trials, it's still very unusual to see this actually being done when developing a vaccine. For example, one study looked at 400 vaccine trials between 2018 and 2023 and found that almost 95% of them explicitly excluded people in pregnancy. This can mean no data, which means no clear recommendation about its use in pregnancy, a problem we still see with the oral cholera and Mpox vaccines. But the tide is slowly turning, and today we're going to discuss why and where this is happening with Professor Flor Munoz. Flor is a specialist in pediatrics and infectious diseases at Baylor College of Medicine in Texas. She has been working on maternal immunization and maternal vaccines since the 1990s, as an investigator, on ethics boards, and as part of safety monitoring groups. And she has been involved in numerous trials which have involved pregnant women and people. And just to note, we'll be using the term pregnant women and pregnant person or people interchangeably. We know the language around this varies depending on location, but ultimately we're just trying to be as inclusive as possible in this conversation. Here's what happened when I spoke to Flor. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Flor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Alisha. It is my pleasure to be here with you today.
Fantastic. So you specialize in maternal vaccines, so immunizations given during pregnancy. Why are these so important?
You know, it has been really the main area of my career, working on vaccines and disease prevention in pregnancy, because I am a pediatric infectious diseases physician. And a lot of what we see in pediatrics has to do with infections early in life. Too early for babies to be protected from their own vaccines or from their own immunity, which needs to adapt and grow as the baby grows. And so we have a period of vulnerability very early in life in which babies do depend on the maternal protection. And you can achieve that through vaccines.
Also, just the human body is so interesting. The fact that you can inoculate a mother and then she can pass on some of those antibodies to her infant to offer some basic protections. That's kind of their first entry point into the vaccination process, these newborns.
Actually, I'm glad you said that because, I guess here we are talking about this process assuming that it's exclusive to vaccines, and it's not. What we are doing is trying to really replicate a natural selection effect, I would say, because what happens naturally is that babies are receiving from their mother all of the immunologic experience that this mother has. So a mother who has been vaccinated, a mother who has had a particular infection, say chickenpox as a child, is going to have that antibody in her blood circulating. And the placenta is just an amazing organ. What it does as it grows through the pregnancy is that it has an active mechanism. So it's almost as a pump that is going to grab all that protection that the mother has from her whole history in her life and pass it on to the baby. Because the babies are going to be born still with an immune system that needs to adapt to the environment. And babies are very, very susceptible in the first few months of life because they don't have that ability to respond. So the babies who receive that antibody from their mother, that's how their survival really is assured, And this is a very natural process. I call it again, like a selection, because you really depend on that for survival. So, there are things like tetanus, for which we don't get exposed very often, ideally. But tetanus is not a disease we can treat. But if we give a vaccine to a mother, or in addition to vaccines that they've received during childhood, they can increase or boost that antibody level. And so those babies will be potentially exposed at birth, but they will not get infected and die, because it's a deadly disease. Same concept has been applied, for the whooping cough. Whooping cough, we normally don't start giving vaccine to babies until 2 months of age, but their highest risk of death is in the first 6 weeks of life. So we need to boost the maternal antibody so babies are born with that.
So why have pregnant women and people historically been excluded from vaccine trials?
I think that what happened was that the decisions to vaccinate pregnant people were based on the risk of the mother or the risk of the baby from a disease, and the fact that vaccines were available, therefore they could be included. But there was no specific research being done. Part of it has to do with concerns regarding the safety of vaccines and how many other products could affect the pregnancy or the fetus. One example in the early 60s, 70s was the story of the thalidomide.
Yeah.
Yes, if you recall that.
Can you speak on what happened, just for those who may not be familiar with this very tragic instance that happened with pregnant people?
Absolutely. So I was, just stating the fact that before thalidomide, pregnant women were not really restricted to take medications or even, at that time, smoke or drink alcohol. It was not something that was known to be a problem necessarily. But thalidomide was actually a medication that was used by some pregnant women for trying to contrast the nausea, the very severe nausea that you can have in early pregnancy. And what happened is that women who were taking this medicine started to have babies with birth defects, a very severe birth defect that is called phocomelia, whereby the limbs of the baby do not develop. So babies were being born without arms, without legs, with very severe malformations that were clearly and directly associated with thalidomide. So that resulted in a tremendous backlash, a lot of concern regarding anything that a pregnant person would take during pregnancy could affect the baby.
Just out of precaution.
Exactly. So very extreme precautions so that you would really not have an opportunity to take medicines or be participating in any type of research related to anything that could potentially or could be perceived as affecting the fetus.
And how has this narrative changed over the last couple decades?
Well, so the main shift that has occurred is that as more research has been developed and the advantages of prevention of diseases through vaccination are much clearer, more technology is available to develop vaccines that are safer than the vaccines that we had 50 and 60 years ago. And the fact that there remains significant risk for a pregnant person and her baby to develop certain diseases, that having participants in research who are pregnant has become actually a way to protect them and their babies from these diseases. So we have shifted from exclusion of pregnant participants in research to actually including them so that they could not be left out or left behind in terms of understanding better vaccines and medications, how they work in pregnancy, how they can prevent these diseases, and how they can be best used in this population.
And so where are we at now? Is it fairly commonplace to have pregnant women and people in vaccine trials?
Well, it has been a gradual evolution, right? So there hadn't been vaccines that were developed exclusively for pregnant people, but we were doing some research, small studies to demonstrate, for example, that existing vaccines, such as whooping cough vaccine, could be given to pregnant people safely, and that it actually would result in antibodies that would then pass to the baby and the baby would be protected. And that has been very successful. But that was a vaccine that was available for everybody. We just needed a little bit of information to be able to really recommend it and use it in pregnancy. What has also changed, though, is that, again, with this knowledge, there are now vaccines that are being developed exclusively to be given to pregnant people so that their babies would be protected. That is the case of RSV, or respiratory syncytial virus, which is a disease that affects babies at very young age. All infants could be at risk, and yet there is no vaccine for babies, there is no treatment for babies, and there's no other way to prevent it than to give this passive immunity, so antibodies that come from the mother, and we can boost those antibodies in the mother through vaccination. So now, research is happening so that we can have actually vaccines that are designed specifically for pregnant people.
So what extra considerations are there in involving pregnant women and people in vaccine trials?
There is a path that has to be followed, because certainly there has to be information collected before we can do research of a new vaccine in a pregnant person. So, for example, there are what we call preclinical studies, so studies that are done not in humans. So that is one step. But once you start going into clinical trials, meaning testing the vaccines in people, then you have to have some data in non-pregnant adults, ideally women of reproductive age, showing that the vaccine is safe and that the vaccine is able to produce the protection that you expect. And once you have that information, for the most part, if you do have then again a disease for which pregnant women or their babies could benefit from this vaccination, then you could consider doing the clinical trial in pregnant people.
How do you make sure a vaccine trial is actually safe for a pregnant person to take part in? For example, what are safety signals? Maybe you can explain that.
A safety signal could be any type of symptom, usually, that some participant in the clinical study could report back to the investigator. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is caused by a vaccine or that is even associated with a vaccine. But we do collect every information that we have regarding any symptoms that could or could not be associated with the vaccine after the administration. We would then tally and compare how frequently each of these symptoms occur in the vaccinated group versus the non-vaccinated group.
And how are they utilized?
Right. So, for example, fever. Fever is not something that you would want to experience during pregnancy, especially in the very early phases of pregnancy, because fever results in inflammation and it's certain changes in our body that could potentially affect the fetus. And so one safety signal that you want to make sure you understand is how much fever you can have from a vaccination. So ideally, for example, vaccines that we want to use in pregnant women or do research for pregnant women to be able to use them would have to have a very low risk for fever. That's just one example. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good example. I just never really thought about the layered efficacy, so that really, because I'm just purely thinking of my own personal perspective, like if I was pregnant, would I want to do a trial? And if it was really explained to me, as you did, that it has gone through layered levels of trials and efficacy, and there aren't these signals that would be benchmarks that should be concerned about as a pregnant mother, that would entice me to want to participate in something like a phase 3 trial. So I think that even just as an outside person who wouldn't have to is not participating in a vaccine trial like this, it gives me comfort knowing that I hope these mothers feel like they're in a very safe and reliable, trial.
Well, that is what has changed, because of the concept of inclusion of pregnant women in research as opposed to exclusion, which is what we do in the early phases. We really still do have to exclude
Right.
pregnant women from
And
the
I think that's
early
fair.
clinical disfigurement. Yes,
Yeah,
of course
you know?
it's fair, right?
Of course.
And so indeed, there has been a lot of change in the last 2 decades because we have appreciated the benefit, as I mentioned.
Right.
You know, we introduced the whooping cough vaccine after the flu pandemic in 2009. You know, there was a lot more interest, of course, in continuing to use flu vaccines in pregnancy globally. And then RSV has been work that has been going on for decades. We know about RSV since the 1960s, and it has been a seasonal, annual outbreak, you know, in northern and southern hemisphere. So global outbreaks that happen every year that are really affecting a very, very large number of babies. I'm telling you, as a pediatric infectious disease doctor, we have our hospitals full of babies with respiratory viruses during our winter season,
Right.
and that happens globally. So having the potential to protect them very early in life when they're most susceptible with a very targeted approach like a maternal vaccination is actually really groundbreaking. And we are in a situation where people are understanding that. And this is why, say, 20 years ago, it was very difficult. It took months to enroll, 30, 40, 50 women in a clinical study. And now we're talking about tens of thousands of women participating in these clinical trials throughout the world because of the understanding of not just the disease and the potential benefits, but also the process, right? So I think you're absolutely right. Knowing how things are done, because it's all very carefully done. Obviously, there are a lot of players. There's not just regulatory pathways and discussions, but as I mentioned, the technology and the vaccines are made much safer right now. There is a lot of clinical work that occurs, so a lot of safe environments where you can do these clinical trials, and there's a lot of accountability as well, right? So we, as an investigator, you have a very important responsibility to be able to work together with a mother so that they make an informed decision about being part of a clinical study.
Hello, I'm Julia Gillard, Chair of Wellcome. Thanks for listening to our podcast, When Science Finds a Way. Wellcome supports researchers around the world to make discoveries and help solve urgent health challenges. We believe in the power of science to build a healthier future and the need for inclusive, collaborative action to ensure everyone can benefit. To get involved, visit wellcome.org. That's welcome with 2 L's. Now, back to the story.
Well, let's travel now to South Africa to hear more about this from Clare Cutland, Scientific Coordinator of the African Leadership in Vaccinology Expertise, or ALIVE, unit at the WITS Health Consortium at WITS University in Johannesburg. The WITS team has been running vaccine trials with pregnant women in South Africa and various other nations across the continent since 2010, including the RSV trial you mentioned. RSV is a common respiratory infection that can lead to fatal complications in newborn infants. There have been multiple attempts to develop a vaccine for it, and this one was created by Pfizer. Its phase 3 clinical trial is a multi-country project called Matisse, and the vaccine has now been approved for use in pregnancy in the U.S. and Europe and is under review for use in several African countries too. Here's Claire to tell us more about working with participants in pregnancy and the Matisse trial.
There's extensive work being done in South Africa related to maternal health and maternal vaccination. Pregnant women are considered as at risk or special populations in any sort of clinical vaccine trial. And cognizance needs to be taken of that fact that they may be at high risk for various illnesses related to the pregnancy, and they also need to involve their family, their group, their spouse, husband, partner in many of the decision making, because the decision that the pregnant mom makes is for herself as well as for her unborn baby. So the participants in the Matisse trial were enrolled across 18 countries, including South Africa and the Gambia in Africa. And they were approached usually at the antenatal care facilities, where they were approached by clinical trial staff, and they were informed about the trial that was happening. At the time, there was no RSV vaccine licensed or registered for pregnant women globally, or anybody globally, actually. And the women were invited to participate in this trial, knowing that the phase 1 and 2 trials had already established safety in non-pregnant participants. There were over 7,000 pregnant women who were enrolled in this randomized control phase 3 trial, and the results of that phase 3 trial were very, very encouraging, with more than 80% efficacy in reducing medically attended respiratory syncytial disease in the young infants up to 3 months of age. One of the biggest challenges that took place in the Matisse trial is that the enrollment and a lot of the follow-up happened during the COVID pandemic. And one of the adverse events that was identified in some of the interim and secondary analyses was that in some areas, particularly in the South African cohort, there were slightly more preterm deliveries in the women who had received the vaccine compared to women who received the placebo. The vast majority of those preterm deliveries took place very late preterm, so 35, 36 weeks, and most of them actually overlapped with the various COVID-19 waves. One of the things to note is that even though there was a slight increase in preterm births, there was no impact on the survival or the health of the babies after their preterm births. Biologically, it's not been ascertained as to why this adverse event would happen. It is concerning, and there's additional work that is being undertaken, specifically a phase 4 vaccine trial, which will be conducted across multiple African countries.
Wow. So this is a complex topic, isn't it? As we heard in this trial, there are follow-ups needed in South Africa because of the questions of preterm births, even though it's unlikely it was related to the vaccine. Phase 4 trials usually look at the side effects caused over time by a new treatment after it's been approved and is on the market. And as Claire explained, the WITS team is planning to conduct one once the RSV vaccine has been approved for use by local regulators. This is so they can continue to closely monitor any possible adverse outcomes from its use, including preterm births. I know you're part of the Independent Safety Monitoring Committee who is overseeing safety for the whole RSV program. And I guess this is a good example of those safety signals we spoke about working and how much safety is always at kind of the front of everyone's mind in these trials.
That is correct. Safety is paramount. I think that whenever we as investigators or participants in the clinical trial really consider being part of a trial, the first question that comes to mind is it safe? Is it safe for me? Is it safe for my baby? Mm-hmm. This is the reason we want to do the clinical studies, because we want to be able to understand, as we mentioned, how to address some of these potential safety signals, especially in the case of this vaccine where you have such high efficacy. So have a very, very
80%
high
is great.
protection.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The high protection like any other, pediatric vaccines, really, where babies are very likely to not have severe disease if the mother receives the vaccine. So despite this this potential signal, the vaccine is approved, as we have mentioned. But I think this is a good example of why it is important to do the clinical trials, because that was detected during the conduct of the trial. And it has allowed for this phase 4 clinical trial to be set up, which is, again, trying to continue to see in a larger population if there's any relationship. Because, to be honest, this was seen in the middle of the COVID pandemic when there were potentially so many other factors that were affecting, this outcome. And at the same time, even though there was a difference within the trial, the rates of preterm birth in that Matisse study were below the background rate, so what you would normally expect to see in terms of preterm birth in the different sites where the study was done. And I'll just mention that there is a commitment from everybody that is involved in these clinical trials, from the vaccine maker to the investigators to the, regulatory and recommending bodies like, the CDC or, other different groups, the WHO, et cetera, to continue to assess how safe these vaccines are, even after they've been approved and licensed. And it is our commitment to be able to stop using a vaccine if there's a concern. I'll say this system works. We have seen it in the past. And you probably have heard of, rotavirus, which is a diarrhea illness disease that in the late 90s, there was a vaccine that was associated with a high risk of this intussusception, which is, some strangling of the gut that is associated also with the disease itself. But, we had a vaccine that was very effective. It was being used. And this particular post-authorization safety surveillance system was able to detect that indeed, this vaccine was associated with a little bit higher risk of that outcome. And so it was discontinued. We stopped using it. And this is done for every vaccine out there.
Yeah. Let's hear now from someone who took part in the Matisse RSV trial. Thandiwe Nkosi was 30 weeks pregnant with her daughter when she was vaccinated as part of the study at the Chris Hani Baragwanath Academic Hospital, also known as BARA. We visited her and her kids and pets at her home in a township just outside of Johannesburg to hear what the experience was like.
My name is Thandiwe Nkosi. I am 34 years old. Before at the clinic, when they introduced me or they told me about it, they didn't give me much information about it. They just told me that this is a study, but if you're interested, you can go to Bara Hospital. But when I got there, they tell me what they're researching about, and then that's when I got interested about it. They told me they're doing a research about pregnant women and the baby. They explained to me that the vaccine is going to protect the child from getting infected with the cold, because normally the kids are so vulnerable. I had to think about it first before going there, because, sometimes you feel skeptical. You can just hear about something and then you just go, you think about maybe the consequences or the effects after that. But trusting that Bara, it's a big hospital, I don't think they will put my health at risk or my child's health at risk. That's when I was like, let me go for it and see how it goes. Yeah. My partner was a little bit concerned about it, thinking maybe it will affect the baby in some kind of ways. But then I was like, no, those people are the expert. Before they give you the vaccine, they need to check your health if you're 100% healthy. They told us everything about what we're going through or what we are doing with the study. Because the lady that I was dealing with directly, she used to explain to us most of the things that we're supposed to do. Any questions that we had to go and ask her. So I think we're well informed about it, yes. After the vaccine, I didn't feel any different in my body. That's why I can say I didn't react or get sick after that. I didn't get anything. So I was fine even after taking the vaccine. We also had the diary that we filled in every day to check if you are doing well and the baby is doing fine. If there's anything, maybe you're not feeling well, you write it down or report to say, I'm not feeling well, then they can check up on you. Even after the baby is born, then you still keep on updating the diary. They will also call me to ask me if I'm fine and if the baby is fine. And if there was anything, then I would call them and say I'm not feeling well or if there's something wrong. But I didn't have any problems after that. But they'll keep on checking up on you to see if you're 100% okay. I think she was around 1 year, 6 months. That's when it stopped. If you're going to a clinic, normally the clinics are not paying much attention to especially the public ones that we're going to. They don't do the thorough checkups of the baby. So if you take part in research, they will be able to check your baby if it's growing well, if there's some abnormalities in your baby's then that's when you can be able to find out or know in time. Definitely, I will do it again. I will do it again. I will even recommend somebody, if anyone is pregnant, to say, if you want your pregnancy to be easy, you go through this process. It was easy for me. I was happy.
I love Thandiwe's jovial perspective on this. It's just such a easy, thoughtful experience in which she felt monitored, safe, in good hands, and she had no adverse effects. So really, she's kind of the poster child of a very positive experience. And it's interesting to hear about all the monitoring and follow-ups with Thandiwe. Is it usual in a trial involving people who are pregnant to have that many follow-ups?
It is, again, because it's very carefully designed. Clinical trials in pregnancy, very, very carefully designed to have as much information as you can prior to being part of the study in terms of ensuring the health of the mother, the health of the fetus, understanding what gestational age they're in to be able to give the vaccine at the right time. And then very close follow-up afterwards. That, again, is really trying to make sure that we don't miss anything. That diary that she mentioned is very important because that's how we know from the moment the vaccine is given until several days later what happens. And, we're not saying the vaccine is causing those symptoms. Pregnancy itself can make you tired, can make you have body aches and so on. But this is why a group receives a vaccine and a group receives not the vaccine, a placebo. And that's how we compare. And that's where we see if there's a difference or not. But, I agree with you. I think that our clinical trial participants are very special and even more special when it comes to a pregnant mother coming into a study because she is in a vulnerable situation in that she's caring for herself, for her health, and for the infant. In addition to that, she mentioned so many important aspects of this, making sure you have the support of the partner, the mother, the mother-in-law, the community, everybody around them is very important. And also, of course, of the physician. So having the trust in the clinicians who are doing the study and the other members of the research team is going to be very, very important. She talked about being informed, and this is, again, very, very key because it's not just understanding what is going to happen or the tests and the care that she's going to receive. And this is actually true that it's very true that in many places, the care you receive under clinical study is more detailed and more thorough than you would in a normal clinical situation. But certainly, I think that one of the aspects that we see in our clinical trial participants is that they do feel important, being part of something bigger. Being part of contributing. And they're doing this for themselves, but they also understand that eventually this is something that could help so many other women and their babies.
So in general, what are the barriers which can make it challenging for trials to take place in the U.S. where you work?
Yes, I think that the challenges are related to just acceptance of vaccine as a preventive strategy. In the U.S., we do have more problems with acceptance than in many other countries. Other countries, our population is more trusting of their healthcare providers, and they will accept vaccination. That is a problem here. The willingness to be part of research, to be able to get informed and to be part of something different that requires your time and effort is a barrier. It's a challenge because it means I'm going to have to not go to work, or I need to take my child from school, or, do things that are outside of my routine to be able to go to a clinic and spend several hours there doing the study procedures, even doing a diary, sometimes we do it electronically.
It's cumbersome.
Now.
It can take time. Yeah. It can get away from you too if you have a busy life.
Right. But I think that the main issue is, to have the proper research team that understands what they're doing and that is able to establish that trusting relationship with participants, and that, you're able to really have good communication and comply with all of the requirements to do a good clinical trial.
Interestingly, Clare Cutland told us that recruitment hasn't been an issue in the countries where WITs work because the prevalence of disease is so much higher, so people are more aware of the risk of not receiving treatments. But Clare did tell us about some of the challenges they do face.
Conducting clinical trials is fun and challenging all at the same time. So some of the challenges that we have experienced in conducting trials in low and middle income country settings that are maybe not as obvious in other high income country settings are the availability of routine healthcare. For example, the access to ultrasounds has been a challenge in many of the countries. What has had to be done across many maternal immunization trials is that the trial has had to be able to train, for example, sonographers and provide sonar machines to ensure that the gestational age and congenital anomalies could be assessed accurately. Other challenges include the fact that many women particularly in low middle income country settings, use injectable progesterone-containing contraceptives, and these can significantly impact the regularity of menstrual cycle, which means that utilizing the last normal menstrual period to assess gestational age is often quite inaccurate. In many countries, but particularly in low middle income countries, many of our pregnant women are exposed to other infectious diseases. So malaria is one of the infectious diseases that can significantly impact the health of the mother, the unborn fetus, and the newborn baby, and can reduce the transfer of antibodies across the placenta. Also, we have seen that, as an example, in South Africa, we've got a very high HIV positivity rate in pregnant women, with almost 30% of pregnant women being infected with HIV. In South Africa and in several other countries, the access to antiretrovirals is good, but in some particularly low-income country settings, access to routine care, for example, antiretroviral treatment, is limited, and therefore viral reduction in the HIV-positive moms is often not good.
There are so many health inequities which feed into this, aren't there? It's interesting to hear about the intersection between pregnancy and other infectious diseases, and just stuff like basic access to prenatal care is so varied in different settings. How do you think including people like pregnant women in trials can make health more equitable?
Yes, I think that is also something that we need to work on. There are different types of inequities. We see it everywhere. We see it even in resource-rich countries. And another one is education, so being able to have access to the information and having access to people that you can talk to and trust to make decisions is also important. We saw probably some of the biggest inequities during the COVID pandemic in terms of just access, just being able to even have it. The vaccines available in countries that needed it. But I think that doing research is one way to be able to increase the opportunity for some groups who normally would not be able to have this type of level of care to receive good antenatal care, to receive good perinatal care, and even follow-up of their babies. And it should not be the reason people participate in the clinical trials. But I think that through research, we could potentially improve the conditions of antenatal care and perinatal care in countries that have been able to set up sites for clinical trials. I do believe that places that are able to set up some of these research units and have now set a new standard for their care and for the population are a good start to be able to disseminate this out.
So what more needs to happen globally to ensure more vaccine trials or other medical research in general can take place involving pregnant women and people?
Yes, there's a lot of work actually happening already. Part of it is having specific guidance on how to do research in pregnant women. That exists in many countries. There are actually international guidance documents that are available. We have also had advocacy groups. And clearly, I think that, the resources are always important, right? The resources, financial resources, and also the physical resources to have teams that are knowledgeable, to have ethics and regulatory review committees that are comfortable to, allow these studies to happen, to have the financial support from large investors, so to speak, that are willing to put, take a risk, if
resources
you will, to be able to study the vaccines in pregnancy. Because I think, now that the doors are open in terms of acceptance of maternal immunization as a strategy for disease prevention that is not just individual, but it's a public health intervention where many other examples are being considered. The question that people should be asking is, why not including pregnant women? And it needs to be justified now why we are excluding pregnant women from a potentially very beneficial vaccine or medication, for that matter, or an intervention, So they are a vulnerable population, although we don't like to use that word because they're not vulnerable in the sense that they're fragile and unable to make decisions. This is a regulatory ethics term. It means it has nothing to do with a person being vulnerable. It has to do with the implementation of additional safety measures.
Extra consideration, yes.
Extra considerations that are actually applied, because we're talking about a mother and her fetus and her newborn that could be affected or not, positively or not, by a particular intervention. And so extra care, extra attention, specifically designed products like vaccines and drugs, specifically designed trials and follow-up studies, safety monitoring needs to be done for these populations.
Wow. Well, you said it. I think the main takeaway that I'm really gathering from what you're saying as what do we do next and why is this work so important is not just to assume the exclusion of pregnant women and people, but to ask, why? Why would we exclude them? And is that necessary? Because we could be doing more of a public service by including them in a safe and effective way in which everyone understands what's going on and everyone feels safe moving forward. I think that that's fantastic. And the work that you do is so incredible. Thank you, Flor, so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your thoughts and education.
Thank you so much. And I think we are at the beginning of a new era, if I may just say, as a last word. Yeah. We've come a long way in the last 2 or 3 decades, and we are about to see more about the impact that maternal vaccination can have in these diseases for which we have vaccines already, but also for the potential for impacting other diseases. So I think the future is very bright, and I think that we need to be positive and optimistic of the fact that we have the right tools to be able to move forward with maternal vaccines.
Thanks for watching this episode of When Science Finds a Way with me, Alisha Wainwright. I also want to say a huge thanks to all our contributors. When Science Finds a Way is brought to you by Wellcome, a charitable foundation that supports the global scientific community, working to build a healthier future for everyone. If you visit wellcome.org/podcast, that's welcome with 2 L's, you'll find transcripts from the show and a whole host of information about the urgent health challenges Wellcome is tackling. And remember to hit the subscribe button here on YouTube for more episodes of the podcast. See you next time.